In this video, I want to talk about defining a brush to paint bush or foliage. We talk about finding a pattern that is repeating by looking at references, painting that pattern to define a new brush, defining a brush by changing brush settings, difference between direction and initial direction, painting bush with our new defined brush, painting flowers to have variation in form and color, using the same approach for defining a brush to paint tree leaves. First of all, look at this reference and ask yourself which pattern is repeating again and again. If you find the right pattern, using the randomness of shape, opacity, direction, and angle, using the brush setting that we have in Photoshop, we can paint that object. The pattern that I think is repeating again and again here is the several leaves. I paint them so I can define a brush using these leaves. Draw a rectangle around the leaves, then go to Edit, Define Brush Preset. Give it a name. The first thing that you need to change is spacing. Spacing is the space between each brush mark. You can also change the angle. By changing the angle of the brush mark will change. We have a category called Shape Dynamic. In Shape Dynamic, if you set control to pen pressure, the size of the brush marks will change based on the pressure you apply to your tablet. So, with more pressure, I have bigger size of the brush tip, and with less pressure, the size of the brush tip will be smaller. You can also play with size jitter. Jitter means randomness. If you increase size jitter, you will have more brush tip size randomness. It means the randomness of the brush tip will be different based on this percentage. Still, the pressure is important, but also randomness will apply to your painting. You can also play with minimum diameter. This is minimum brush tip size diameter. So if you increase the percentage, the minimum diameter of the brush will increase. You can see that when I increase minimum diameter, even with a very small pressure to the tablet, the size of the brush tip is big. So even with a very low pressure, when I paint, the size of the brush tip is not small. It is as small as I determine in the minimum diameter. You can change the angle of your brush based on the way you move your hand on the tablet. You can set it to direction or initial direction. Let's see the difference. Here I set control to direction. Now, if I paint, the brush stroke will follow the direction of my brush. But if I set it to initial direction, the angle is locked as soon as I touch the tablet to paint. The initial angle will be saved during the whole brush stroke. Now, when I paint, the angle that every brush mark is paint on the canvas looks like that the brush stroke is following my hand. Another item that you can change is transfer. The setting here will control the opacity of your brush. With more pressure, the opacity of brush mark will increase. As you can see, with more pressure, I will have more opacity, and with less pressure, I will have less opacity. Here, again, we have minimum. By increasing the minimum percentage, you are telling to Photoshop that the minimum opacity of the brush marks should increase. Still, the opacity of the brush marks depends on the pressure I apply to the tablet, but the minimum opacity is controlled by this setting. Again, we also have opacity jitter here. If you increase the percentage, you will have more opacity randomness of brush mark. Still, the opacity depends on the pressure you apply to the tablet, but also this randomness with this percentage applies to your brush marks. Angle jitter control the angle randomness of every brush mark. By increasing it, you will have more randomness of the angle of a brush when it is painted on the canvas. No, when I paint on the canvas, the angle of every single brush mark depend on direction, which I set it in control, and also the percentage of the angle jitter. This combination is very useful when you want to paint an object from nature. Let's select a green color and test how our brush works. You can always return back and change a setting to see how changing a setting will create a new result. I select a dark shade of green, then I gradually in 3 or 4 steps, I select lighter shade of green. I paint each layer on top of the last layer. To better mix lighter leaves with darker leaves, I recommend to fade lighter layers to darker layers. The brush pen pressure that we already talked about it will really help to control the opacity and will help you to mix lighter leaves with darker leaves.